factors that go into scoring. So I'll talk a little bit through that here in a second. And then the other change would be sort of an update, an obvious update to the fact that we've got new projects, we've got new data about projects, and of course we have reset our analysis on the existing conditions and trends for the areas around these projects. So there's a huge data refresh on top of some minor tweaks to the structure of our scoring methodology. But as we get into this, sometimes the initial conversations about project scoring can be filled with anxiety for applicants. And there's no need for that, really. It's important to remember that the scoring is not our end goal. It's just simply a way to organize the hundreds of projects that we're looking at. They're all competing for limited funding. We're trying to find the priorities that are out there to achieve the regional goals that have been set by the policy board. And often these goals have competing objectives within. And so the scoring is just a way to sort of take stock of what's out there and assess each project for its individual ability to achieve as much of that goal set as possible. In the end, what ultimately determines which projects are funded through the plan is a combination of variables. The scoring is one of them, but the grant eligibility of the funding sources that we have available play into this. And so there are certain projects can only be funded by certain grants. And so the flow of money is going to determine to a great extent which projects ultimately get funding through the plan. And then the other is scheduling. And so obviously projects that have a more sense of urgency or have some programming history already or just generally more near term, they're going to be looked at more favorably regardless of the project score that is calculated through the methodology that we're going to be talking about today. Then in the end, one of the things that I like to remind the applicants of is that we update our regional transportation plan every 5 years. And so if your project isn't identified for funding through that 25-year horizon that we're scheduling for with this plan, there will be another opportunity 5 years from now for you to get your plan funded. What we're really trying to make sure we do is not leave out in the cold any projects that are ready for programming. So that's really the priorities, just to make sure that the fiscally constrained project list that will result from this process is inclusive of all the short-term priorities that you have, as well, in particular, those that sort of meet the regional goals and objectives that have been laid out by the policy board. So just keep that in mind as we go through this and take the scoring result with the somewhat of it's important, but take it with a grain of salt that it's sort of just a piece of the puzzle that we're working with here. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide, Sean. And so this is just a reminder that what we're going to be talking today with respect to the scoring is derived from the policy framework that was initially put into place for this plan update in October of 2019. It's been updated a few different times through endorsements by the policy board to incorporate some additional work that's been done by staff and the technical, the Transportation Coordinating Committee, you folks, over the last couple of months. It's a living document that initially got started back in October, but from this policy framework, we have derived the regional goals, and we'll talk about the 6 goal areas here in a second. And then in terms of the sort of the individual scoring elements within each of these goals, those are guided in large part by the objectives and then the measures that are on the table to help us understand if we're achieving our goals over the long term. So again, the scoring element here is derived from this policy framework, which has been in place since October. So let's go ahead and move to that next slide. And y'all will all remember during the September TCC and Transportation Policy Board meetings, a discussion about how to weight the relative importance among the set of goals or between the set of goals. The goals being on the screen here: state of good repair, improving roadway safety, managing congestion, providing economic opportunity, minimizing disruption of our transportation improvements, and aligning our regional investments with plans that are already in place, either at the local, regional, or state level. So those are the goal areas that have been identified since October of 2019. And then last month, what we did is we assigned a relative weight of importance between them. The leading or the most important goal through the pairwise process that y'all participated in was to improve roadway safety at 30% out of 100 possible, sort of out of a universe of, if this all adds up to 100, 30% of that would be sort of weighted towards roadway safety improvement projects. State of good repair and maintenance was second, and then congestion management and economic opportunity were third, and then minimizing disruption and aligning with plans were at 10% each. This slide is actually got a typo. Those two should be 10%. So that was a look at the weighting of importance between the goal areas. And so now in the next couple of slides, we're going to share with you the factors within each of these areas that are playing into the calculation of a project score. So Sean, go ahead and move on to the next slide. We'll take the top three here: state of good repair, roadway safety, and congestion management. And so I'm going to list through each one of these the characteristics that are derived from the sources of information that we have, that when a condition or characteristic exists is going to give a project a more favorable outcome in terms of scoring. So in the sense of state of good repair, we're looking at what the primary objective of this project is that you've proposed. When you fill out your application, you indicated the primary objective. And if you indicated that it is to maintain or repair the system, then that's an opportunity for you to score well within this category. But beyond, just sort of your stated objective, we're also looking at the existing conditions and trends on the ground that are sort of creating a situation that is conducive for having maintenance and repairs. And we're also looking at the proposed features or elements of your project that you indicated to us through the application. So if you said like you're going to be doing roadway maintenance as part of your project within the scope of work, in the check boxes that you filled out, you're gonna be given some credit here in this category. So let me just go through these. So we're looking at prioritizing routes that are on the NHS or the strategic highway network. We're looking at prioritizing routes that have higher traffic volumes, higher freight volumes, that have bridges that are in fair or poor condition. And when you are proposing features within the project that relate to repair and maintenance. And so as your project has sort of the area conditions that relate to these elements, or you've proposed features related to repair and maintenance, you're likely to score well in this category. Moving over to roadway safety, we're looking at projects where the primary objective is to improve safety, but we're also looking for projects to reward projects that are in high crash areas or on routes with crashes that involve fatalities, crashes that involve bike ped users, and crashes that involve trucks. And then we're also looking at your project scope and the features that you're proposing within that relate to improving safety. Within congestion management, we're looking at any instance where you indicated the primary objective is to mitigate congestion, but we're also looking to see if your proposed project is in a congested condition, either today or in the future, whether it's congested because the travel speeds are estimated or forecasted to be below the expected free flow, or if the volume capacity ratio would indicate congestion. We're also looking to see if your project is in an area of high active transportation demand, which would make it suitable for multimodal investments as a congestion management strategy. So this is transit, walking, and biking demand that we've measured across the region. We're looking at the underlying bicycle and pedestrian level of service for the route that you're trying to improve, and we're prioritizing routes with a low level of service for walking and biking. And then we're also, we've worked with our Bicycle Pedestrian Advisory Committee to identify the areas within the region that are the most important for investments in walking and biking. And they develop their own methodology to identify those areas of importance. But when your project falls within an area that is determined to be of high importance for walking and biking investments, particularly as a way of managing congestion through multimodal opportunities, and then you propose those multimodal improvements, you're likely to be rewarded for that through this process. And then again, any of the features of the scope of work that relate to mitigating congestion are rewarded within this category. The features are grouped into the four CMP, the congestion management process, identified four strategy areas: operations improvements, multimodal opportunities, capacity improvements, and managing transportation demand. So we've grouped the features that you may have identified into one of those strategies, and then when you are essentially checking one of those boxes related to the strategy, you're going to be rewarded within this category of congestion management. So let's move on to the final three scoring categories, Sean, on the next slide. Okay, so we start here with economic opportunities. So you're going to be rewarded in this category if you indicated that the primary objective of the project is to increase economic access. But you're also going to be rewarded if the project is happening within a planned growth area. And so this is where we rely a lot on some of the local planning work that's identifying planned growth areas that we can ascertain either from your input or through our analysis. But we're relying heavily on urban growth boundaries as being a proxy for sort of the anticipated expansion of our urban footprint into the future. We're also looking at high growth areas as they are forecasted. As you know, we have a 2040 population employment forecast allocated to the parcel level. A lot of that is influenced directly by the economic trends and the market forces that are going to be driving growth and development to the future. And so projects that are occurring in high growth areas to support the economic opportunity that's anticipated across the region are going to be rewarded within this category. Projects that are serving high employment centers are going to be rewarded. And then projects that are on routes with high commercial vehicle activity will be rewarded in this category. And then finally, we're also looking at your scope of work for elements that are the typical type of investments that are sort of go in before a major economic development investment, things like streetscaping, curb and gutter upgrades, a new capacity largely with on the main roads and interstate interchanges and so on and so forth. So when you're doing things in this list, you would be rewarded with an economic opportunity category. And then we move on to minimizing disruption, which is the fifth goal area of the policy framework. And what we're doing here is essentially starting every project off with the maximum number of points, and then we're taking deductions in cases where the project is running into anticipated conflicts with either the natural environment or the vulnerable communities that exist across the region. So here we're looking at the overlap with environmental conflicts. And so Ben Gramlin and the staff working with our environmental roundtable have identified a set of environmentally sensitive areas, and we're looking to see what percentage of your project's length is traversing through at least one of those types of areas. So that's a consideration here. And so the more you're overlapping, the more points that will be deducted in this category. We're also looking at the sort of just the proximity of your project to the number of those environmentally sensitive areas. There's a list of, I think, 8 or 9 environmentally sensitive area layers that we've identified. So we're counting the number of areas that you are in close proximity to with your alignment. And then finally, we're looking at proximity to vulnerable communities. And in particular, we're looking at how a physical investment may be sort of disproportionately impacting these communities in a negative way. So that's a look at this category and the things that would lead to deductions of that maximum point total associated with this goal area. And then finally, the alignment with other plans. This is really aimed at prioritizing projects that are have programming histories, either some obligation already or commitments already made through the TIP or the Improve Act. or projects that really have a sense of urgency to move in the short term. So projects that sort of check those boxes are going to fare well in this category. And then projects that are specific recommendations from a local plan or a local, regional, state study are going to be rewarded within this category. We also included in this category this overlap with environmental challenges. And so this is analysis that's done within the environmental framework that I just mentioned that BIM leads for us. But the twist here is that whereas in the minimize disruption goal area, we're looking at where the project may cause a disruptive or pose a disruptive sort of reaction within the environment. In this category, alignment with other plans, we're looking at where the environment may make your improvement a bit more challenging to get implemented, either make it sort of more time consuming or just it might make it cost a lot more money because the things that you're trying to do to mitigate the impacts that you might have on the environment. So that's a consideration within this goal area here. And so that's a look at the list of sort of elements that we're looking at to either reward or penalize your project from a scoring standpoint. And so, Sean, if you go to the next slide, let me talk a little bit more about the sources of information that we use to reward or deduct points within those scoring categories. And so there's three sources of information, and most of you are likely very familiar with these already, but some of the information that we use comes directly from your applications that you submit through apply.nashvilleinpo.org. We're looking at your project description to include its location and proposed scope of work. We're looking at the project history and the anticipated cost estimates that you've provided, and we're looking at the project's purpose, goals, and objectives. And so where that information is being used to ultimately assign point totals within each of those goal areas. Another source of information that we use, and it's probably the most influential, to be honest with you, in terms of assigning points, is the conditions and trends indicators that are produced by our research team to represent existing conditions on the ground related to transportation system performance or sort of the land use characteristics around the roadway network. So the results of the analysis that they do is what we upload to the apply.nashvilleinpo.org app, which is appended to your project at the bottom of your project sheet. So we take that data that describes performance and conditions, both existing and projected into the future, to arrive at our assessment of a great deal of the scoring factors that we just talked about. And then the third source of information is the staff qualitative assessments that are being conducted that Sean has talked about in previous meetings, where for each project that was submitted, we have staff going in and looking at the potential that project has for addressing regional goals and objectives, the potential that project has for causing disruption to vulnerable communities or environmental assets. And then they're also looking to find opportunities to enhance the outcomes of your projects through recommending back to you improved project design or scoping considerations. And so these are the three sources of information that allow us to put numeric values to the elements within the scoring categories that I just mentioned. And then this next slide, Sean, is a look at the tool that is sort of the front door to the tool that we're using to do all the calculations. It's basically a spreadsheet model. And I'm not seeing that slide, Sean. There you go, perfect. So this is basically just a screenshot from the main page of this spreadsheet modeling tool, where we go in by category. And so you see the 6 goal areas here. They're color coded, and you'll recognize this color coding as we go through the process. And from this point forward, these colors will be associated with each of their goal areas. But within each one of those, you can see here the specific variables from the data sets that we're pulling in to calculate the score for each category. And so if anybody's interested in seeing this workbook, it's something we're willing to share, but it's not something that we're going to go through today. And so if you go on to the next slide, me talk a little bit about how we'll ultimately do our ranking. And so, you know, back in the development of the 2035 plan, what we ended up doing was calculating scores for all 300 plus projects and then essentially publishing the raw score and then sorting the list, you know, rank order, highest to lowest score. We changed that approach through the development of the 2040 plan, where we got away from the raw score, because I think the raw score is a bit distracting and really unimportant in terms of trying to figure out what it is that we're going to be funding. So instead, what we did is we came up with a 5-tier project ranking system for the 2040 plan that we will apply for the 2045 plan. And the 5 tiers include, at the top, 5-star projects, which are consensus priorities per regional policies. And these tend to be sort of the grand visionary projects that that we know we need to be accomplishing over the next 25 years that have a lot of consensus behind them. And I'll give you an example of this. And so with the 2040 plan, one of these was the upgrade and modernization of the downtown interstate loop. So that was a 5-star project. It didn't matter how that project scored through the process. It was a policy priority to make that sort of a headline of our regional transportation plan. Also following this category tends to be recommendations and projects that stem from the regional corridor studies, where we're looking to introduce high capacity or rapid transit in the main regional corridors. And so those types of projects are what will be ultimately sort of the leading headline priorities of our plan and would be ranked at the top of our list as a 5-star project. The next tier are what we call the 4-star projects, which are essentially existing projects with programming history. So regardless of how a project scores through the process I just described, if there is a previous commitment and that project remains in good standing without any fatal flaws, it will be programmed in the plan as a 4-star priority project, regardless, again, of how it scores. Now, within the 4-star category, projects would be ranked according to the star, but they will all be in this second tier, regardless of their score, compared to projects that are outside of this tier. So then we get into the sort of the next category of tiers, which are the where we take the, generally speaking, the new starts projects, so projects that have no programming history, but they have been submitted as sort of the next in line investments for our region. We then sort those by project score and then group them into 3 tiers according to just the breaks and thirds. And so the new starts projects scoring the top third would become 3-star projects, and then so on and so forth. So in the end, what we're going to be doing is, as we apply the limited funding for the projects that are competing for it, we'll start at the top of this tier list and work our way down. And then in the end, we'll have, you know, likely somewhere in the order of 80% of the projects that we're looking at funded and programmed into the RTP. And then, you know, about 20% of the projects ultimately will not be awarded funding through this 25-year schedule, but will continue to be identified as an important priority for the region in an illustrative, sort of unfunded priority. So we make sure we're continuing to communicate the investments that are needed, regardless of the amount of money that we have available to get those things done. So again, this is a 5-tier project ranking system that was used for the 2040 plan that will be adapted to the 2045 plan. So let's get to then a look at the preliminary results. If you go to the next slide, Sean, this is a screenshot from one of the handouts that we produced during the countywide workshops for the 2040 plan about 5 years ago. I'll give you a sense of, let me walk you through kind of these columns and what we're looking at. There's a little bit of lag on my end, Sean, so if you haven't changed the slide, if you could go ahead and do that now. Perfect. All right, so what you're looking at here is basically a simplified project list. And so we have obviously a lot more details for each of the projects that would be represented by this list, but it's sort of just slimmed down so that your eyes can instead focus on the result of the scoring. So there's just enough information about what the project is so you can understand what we're talking about. But let's focus instead on the last few columns, starting with the column that is labeled tier. So this is when you get the list here in a second. Again, this is a sample from the 2040 plan. You're going to want to first look at the tier column, and this is going to tell you the current thinking in terms of where your project is falling within that 5-tier system according to the sort of the parameters that I just described for determining those. And then for the next few columns there where you see the color coding and the plus, minus, and equal signs, what this is going to be is a column for each of the goal areas, and there are 6 of them this time. So we went from, I guess there were like 8 goal areas last time, 8 or 9. We've collapsed that down to 6 through the new policy framework. And so for each one of those goal areas, your project will have a score. Those are then added together according to the distribution of weights that the policy board has endorsed to a total score, which is going to lead to the tier that's assigned to you. But what we want to communicate is how well your project is scoring within each goal area relative to other projects. And so the way to read this is within, say, that first column, which back in 2040 was system preservation, this first project on the list scored higher than average in this category, but it scored lower than average in the multimodal category. And then obviously the equal sign with the gray color coding is where the project scored at or about average compared to other projects for that category. So it's a good way to see where your project is doing well, or where maybe it's not as productive as others for goal areas. And so that's how to read this. And so with that, Sean's going to go ahead and post the URL to access the initial results from the scoring model. I want to we'll talk about this in a second in terms of what our remaining steps are. But we want to go ahead and share with you what we're seeing in the scoring models. We just ask that you understand that it will continue to change over the next few days as we continue to get information in from project sponsors and our staff finish up their work with the quality of assessments. So that URL, I think it's in the chat box now, but I'll say it out loud so you can get to it. It's at gnrc.org/sample RTP scores. So if you go there now, you'll be able to see the first look at how your projects are doing within the context of the scoring methods. This sheet, once you access it, it is sorted by applicant alphabetically, and then by the improvement type, which is the proposal column on the handout. So it's going to be at the top of the list. You're going to see City of Brentwood, and then you're going to see their projects sorted by the improvement type. And those are things like, roadway traffic operations is a type, roadway widening is a type. The one improvement type I'll make mention of here, because most of these are self-evident, is roadway multimodal. That's the category where we're trying to capture basically capacity improvements to the roadway network that are inclusive of bike ped accommodations. So that's the distinction between that and a traditional roadway widening project. If you see any coding on any of this with respect to improvement type that just doesn't make sense to you, feel free to reach out to our staff. We're still going through a bit of QC on this. And so as those categories change, it could have a ripple effect on the results that you're seeing. One more thing I'll say about this initial look at the model results is that the model results are really only applicable to projects that are on the transportation network. So, and this is not different from last time. And last time we had a conversation about how like off-system greenways or projects that seek to acquire new or replace transit vehicles or programmatic investments or planning studies. Those things are not, they don't fit the scoring model because the scoring model is weighted heavily towards the conditions on the ground in the area in which that project's going to be implemented. So we'll have a different process for sorting out the priorities for transit investments, for example. And we can have that conversation this morning if you like. It's just not the emphasis of our workshop today. So as you go through here, don't be misled into thinking that multi-use pathways and greenways or transit-related investments are scoring poorly. We've just basically zeroed out the scores across the goal areas for those types of projects, just because the model doesn't fit programmatic or sort of equipment type purchases. So with that, I'll pause here for any immediate questions or comments. Again, if you've been around for at least one cycle, this probably looks familiar to you. We understand it's complex. It's not complicated. It's not hard to figure out, but it's a lot of moving parts here. It might take you some time to come up with those questions or comments, so we'll be patient. Let me go to the final slide that I have for you. And that is a quick look at the remaining work and next steps. So Sean, if you go ahead and continue on to the next slide. I want to emphasize here that these are preliminary results that are going to be impacted by the remaining work. So the sort of top of the list is that we're still finalizing project details. And so we're in conversation still with some of the project sponsors to make sure we either understand what you're proposing, or in some cases, we're coming back to you saying, okay, this project it's not workable, right? Like it doesn't have logical termini, for example, which is a requirement for federal funding, is that you have to start a project and end the project according to sort of predetermined rules. You can't stop a highway expansion project, for example, at a county line. You've got to sort of connect that improvement to the next major intersection, for example, or stop short of that county line, but terminate it at a node, if you will, on the network. So that's an example of what I mean by logical termini. So those types of things are going to impact scoring as we kind of get through the conversations that we're having with sponsors about project scope. The other thing that we have left to do is, I think we're getting very close, but staff is wrapping up now the qualitative assessments. Some of this is, it's dependent on having good project information. So it's difficult to assess projects where there's still a lot of ambiguity about what's being proposed. And so completing the staff qualitative assessments is something that's just going to lag behind that first bullet there. But both of these are very important in terms of the score calculations. And so the results are going to continue to change as the inputs are changing as a result of those two processes. This third bullet here is a next step for you. So just like we did with the development of the 2040 plan, we provide an opportunity for you as a community. So if you're Metro, for example, we don't mean like Public Works, Planning, Mayor's Office, Parks and Rec individually. We mean Metro government as a whole. We would ask each community to get together, and by community, I mean municipality or county government, and determine, if you've applied for multiple projects, which one of those is your top priority. And whichever project you identify as your top priority will get some additional points within the goal area number 6, which is aligning with other plans. And so that's not accounted for yet because we haven't asked that question for this round of the plan update. So you might go back to your records last time, or we can tell you what you identified as your top priority last time. But regardless, you have an opportunity to sort of start anew and identify your top priority. And one of the reasons we do this is because we understand that sort of a regional perspective isn't always going to align with the local perspective, and we don't want to disrespect your local perspective in this process, so we want to account for that. It just can't override what we're trying to do at a regional scale, because